Yeah, we have been looking at communication and media systems. Many programs emphasize practical skills, vocational skills, and some of the graduate studies program, like the master's program, also have many theoretical perspectives built into their syllabus or curriculum. Very often, theoretical perspectives in our program are dismissed as having less, or in many cases no value for the kind of jobs that our students might be engaged in. It might be journalistic functions, it might be information functions, it might be content development, or it might be even entertainment. I would take the view that any kind of knowledge or understanding of the situation we work in, or the society to whom we work for, requires a certain amount of broader understanding, or some would argue that it requires a deeper understanding of the society in which we live. Communication and media studies historically have not necessarily ignored theory as such, but their preoccupation, probably justified from their functional and economic aspects, has been highlighting the functionality of the media or the communication system in which we work. And it's very difficult to pin down the functions that they perform, because it would be in the category of definition, and many a time definitions would have limitations on the kind of flexibility and the range of options an individual would have to discharge his or her functions. Nevertheless, many have tried to broadly situate these functions in terms of what does it mean both to the people and to the media institutions. For example, there is a very strong understanding that does media function or cater to a social need, which of course is, as you know, a very broad canvas, but nevertheless it kind of subsumes many of the things or many of the activities that people engage in. There are have been theories in the past, for example agenda setting function, which I'm sure that you would be using in your classes, is of the view that media based on its power, media based on its influence, is it vulnerable, or does it have a tendency to set the agenda, and whose agenda is it setting has been a question that has been raised in the past as well. There are perspectives which within the agenda setting function also you have perspectives on, for example, gatekeeping, that obviously media cannot be capsuling all the content that it receives, because obviously both your reading habits, listening habits, or viewing habits have certain threshold limits as to how much you can comprehend, or how much attention you can pay. So naturally there is a certain amount of packaging or condensing or compacting the content. And it is here that it has been argued that both the agenda setting dynamics allows for a certain amount of gatekeeping that occurs. So something is let in and something is not allowed. And there are people who suspect that this function of gatekeeping is so discretionary that it may at times reflect the motivations of either the journalists or the institution that he or she would be working for. With a very long time, and even now, one of the dominant discourses in media has been the, let us say, the educational function. Right now in India, you see a parallel but a very significant movement towards harnessing, the range of technologies. Some would call it new technologies, some would call it media, for educational purposes. And India has a very long and an established record of harnessing mass media for educational purposes. We have had programs for farmers, we have had programs for teachers, and so on and so on. There are also notions that media would be performing or looking at culture, and this is a very contentious and a problematic area, because the range of definitions that is brought to bear on what is culture is I would say is so vast that it's very difficult to kind of give even a what should I say, a working outline of what culture is. Scholars like for example Raymond Williams in his book on culture has in the first few or in the first chapter made a problematic understanding and definition of culture, essentially reduced to a way of thinking, a way of living, a belief system, a value system. You call it, and I think that each one of you, from wherever you are working, would have certain localized perceptions of culture, and they may at times be performing arts, for example. They may at times be rituals, beliefs, temple practices or other religious practices, and so on. So you also have a very what should I say, a skewed perspective about the relationship between communication and technology, which is a very it has got undercurrents, as I would say. But if you look at the evolution of communication technology down from the 15th century onwards to the whatever is happening in the field of either hardware or software, you would always see there is a certain amount of technological imperative or a technological underpinning. And so international commissions such as McBride have tried to look at communications and its functionalities, for example, and they try to give a broad framework of what kind of functions we have. Now why do we need to understand media or communication functions? It's just not necessarily always for kind of taking off in a classroom situation and say media does this, media does that. No, it has got something more to it than just defining or understanding the function. What it essentially means is that the engagement that people have with the media or the communication ecosystem is a reflection of their day-to-day existence, and right from trying to find out information about railways, buses, transport. You have people frequently going to the media to kind of get this information. Of course, the information and entertainment needs are by and large a very, what should I say, pervasive use of media of all kinds in our society. Now, if the society is engaged with media for for a long period, as in 300, 400 years, if you look at the print as one of the forerunners of what we understand as mass media, you would see that there are correlations that people try to bring about. So, for example, the European Renaissance movement. If you look at the works of, for example, Elizabeth Eisenstein, there is a very important contribution she tries to make about printing press and in the age of Reformation and Renaissance. In the Indian context, historians, cultural historians like Venkatachalapati have talked about the cultural histories of printing. So see, the media's interface is not always as reduced as we make it out to be in a classroom situation. Now, Canadian scholarships, particularly the work of Harold Adam Innes and Marshall McLuhan, have perspectives, for example, where they try to look at both the transition, evolution, and also the intermingling of different kinds of societies. For example, there is a distinction that is made as to what is oral society, what is literate society, and what is electronic society. I mean, that kind of a linearity in different kind of societies, in this particular case, has media and communication as the framework of analysis. And you also have distinction that is made between time and space media. Space media as in which is kind of spreading across kind of a geographical spatial kind of distribution. And you also have a certain kind of media, like for example the edicts, you have for the scriptures, the epigraph. Epigraphists talk about certain frozen records of history. And what does it mean? I mean, one of the major discourses in communication or even in the context of knowledge societies has been the notion of monopoly, that people who have access to, people who are knowledgeable have ensured that there is monopoly, so that the rest of the common society does not partake in the benefits of the knowledge society. You have critical perspectives on the Indian system, for example, where it has been argued that the upper caste had kind of monopolized both the production, distribution, and its interpretation has been argued as formed certain societal norms and certain beliefs. So knowledge and its association with power has been at the background of many discourses, but very often in our communication studies this is not highlighted or recognized to the extent it should be. Particularly when you try and look at the other kind of linearity that people attempt with regard to agricultural societies, industrial societies, and they talk about post-industrial societies. The work of, for example, Daniel Bell, the making of an industrial society, talks about this linearity. And there are others who take off from the post-industrial society and talk about the notions of information societies, and where the whole perspective is on the fact that information is the kind of driving force in the functioning of many communication systems across the world. And at times we reduce information to just entertainment. At times we reduce it to having absolutely no significance. But there is a considerable amount of work which has been done as to how information has been and is in fact a commodity. The whole notion of in today's world, when you are paying for data, where data, every bit of data that you use has been already and is going to be built, which means that we are talking already about I have this much of data, I have that amount of data, because you are measuring your device and your capacity to communicate in terms of both your ability to buy data and speed of at which data travels. All this have become variables, and it is this set of factors that actually determines access and equity. Very often we use terms access and equity at times loosely, I would say, but what does access and equity mean is not is about affordability, one, and affordability is now presently linked at what kind of services you have, and at what price these services are made available. People might say that prices, the content is free, etc., etc. And it has been argued by scholars like Dallas Smythe, for example, where the notion of free content has been effectively contested. What he talks about is that content is something where is linked to a strong amount of advertising, and he makes a brilliant argument to say that audience is actually delivered to the advertiser. So media becomes a vehicle by which audience is delivered. Now, cut to modern era of measurement indicators like BARCs or TRP. If you look at the philosophy by which they operate, it is essentially measuring you and your habits, and telling the advertisers that, look here, these are so many households, and this is the composition, and this is the work. What makes it more easy, functional, and also what should I say, highly monetized, is the era of digital communication. In digital communication, you see, everybody, why were we pushed for DTH kind of a subscription base? Because DTH allows for every movement of yours in front of the device that you have to be tracked. Now, you might wonder, what does it mean? So what? We have got used to it, etc., etc. But the larger question is, teachers like you should be able to understand, is that audience measurement is linked to audience profiling, which of course I have told you earlier. It also linked to content production. Why is it that we criticize and say that only this kind of content are produced? People are obsessed with it. Now, when people are obsessed with it, how does the supplier know that people are obsessed with it? Obviously, there are measurements. So historically, since the 1920s, measurement agencies have become a very important institutional mechanism for media operations, both domestic as well as global. So, having said that, the important aspect that I am trying to emphasize is that the economics of media, economics of communication. I'm using communication media, interchangeably, and in the other presentation, I have already talked about some of the range of definitions we have on, for example, new media, which I have, outlined what it means and how does it translate in terms of our users and concerns about new media. So, when we are looking at communication and media and the economics of it, there are many currents that come in the discourse. I mean, these discourses are not necessarily kind of slotted as political and economic framework. What the political economy actually does is to kind of unravel and understand that there is a governance system of any kind that you imagine. I mean, governance system need not always be as per your visualization, as per your expectation. The world is made of multiple governance systems. There are, there is a rule by the military, there is a rule by, political party, there is a dominance of a particular political party, there are definitions of democracies like India, and there is a party leadership in countries like China, there is a party leadership differentiation in Russia. So you have multi what should I say, multipolar, if I can use the term, governance systems across the world. So I mean, I don't think anybody has a justification in making a relative assessment of the governance system that we have versus what is available in our neighboring countries. Very often, these observations are made, but what we have to understand is that it takes a while for evolution of governance system, and it is determined by a set of factors that are unique and endemic to that society that they all live in. But the reason why I am bringing governance system is politics is about power, which obviously all of us know and understand. But where does the power come and how is it sustained? See, power comes from, let us say, if we are talking about a democracy like India, power comes because people have to vote, people have to choose. And how do you make informed decisions on who your leadership should be? Obviously, they have a view that they communicate. Many times the communication might be just the identity of the individual or the group might become a rallying point for people to say that, well, I mean, this relates to my identity, and therefore I am going to choose this particular leader. So there are in the modern communication, what should I say, ecosystem, as we saw in the elections, particularly in the elections of 2014, and it's likely to be accentuated in the forthcoming elections as well. There's a large amount of marshalling. There's a large amount of what should I say, collation of resources that political parties of all kinds. I mean, it does not matter whether you are X party or Y party, or whether you believe in this ideology or that ideology. All of them would like to place their point of view. So this is not something new. For example, mass media histories have told us that the propaganda function and the public opinion formation function has been one of the mainstay of broadcasting operations, and you have had two major world conflicts, and in which you have had propagation of ideology of a set of nations as against other competing and contesting claims. So the notion that power can be acquired, or power can be marshaled, or power can be gained by putting across, obviously means that putting across to a large section, call it mass media or call it niche media, whatever it is, the basic thing is that it has to reach. It has to reach people who are going to participate in the election. So communication and political power that way is closely related, and this relationship translates to very often we think, oh well, we have 800 television channels, we have 853 million cell phones. So because we have such a wide variety of channels, 245 broadcasting stations, according to some statistic, if we have so many media outlets, the immediate thing that comes to your mind is, oh well, I mean, India is a great country, you have 800 different perspectives, you have 245 different perspectives. No, it doesn't happen that way. In fact, if you look at the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India's consultation paper on ownership, for example, it talks about what you call as a shrinking public sphere. I mean, public sphere argument, as you know, was made by European scholarship through the work of Habermas and others. Habermas, in a way, represents one strong tradition of European critical thinking, what we would call as Frankfurt School. I'm sure that you will have some time to look up what Frankfurt School means and how does it look at communication and media. So the shrinking notion of public sphere amidst plenty of channels means that the agenda and the discourse gets shrunk. And why does it get shrunk, or how does it get shrunk, is something which relates to the economic dimensions of media operations. Media operations are not diversified ownership. In fact, as early as 1955, the Press Commission had looked at the structure of print ownership. It is not that we have had very what should I say, acceptable forms of ownership in the past. Even print ownership, we have references which talk about the control of the steel lobby, and people talk about it as the steel press. There is a lobby which comes from Calcutta, and there's a whole description of print which is the jute lobby. So you've had media ownership as a variable for critiquing. But what I'm trying to say is that critiquing is one aspect which can be done and dismissed. But dismissal of ownership reduces the scope of your interpretation as to the structure of the media industry. Now, here is where you have to look at the framework that has evolved over a period of time. Yeah, when countries like India got their independence, and as more than 90 countries gained their independence at some point or the other immediately after the post-World War II. There was a euphoria, naturally, in many of these nations because they had gained independence and they were looking forward to their own leadership and charting their own path of development, etc. And I mean that is something that is perfectly justified because colonial experience had brought in a certain degree of what should I say, loss of faith in one's own ability. So when nations embarked on their path of development, for example, and did political independence mean anything? The answer is probably no, because economically there were few centers of power, be it in terms of control over the market, control over the production, control over the core technologies, etc., etc. So news and media, which was constantly relaying information about happenings in different parts of the world, had its own share of economic considerations. For example, unlike some of the better off or more resourceful newspapers, not all newspapers could have correspondents all over the world. So they had to depend on what we call as news agencies, and as initially flagged, there were 5 big news agencies, and incidentally they all came around the time when the economic consolidation in the respective capitals was also taking place, be it France, be it Britain, be it the United States, and so on. So one of the things that was of concern is that given the control or given the distribution of news sources that these agencies had in different parts of the world, in different countries, there was what we call as the earthquake, famine kind of a syndrome, people would call, and this was in the news, and nothing critical about the fact that these are in the news. But what was increasingly felt is that this and the immediate aftermath of independence, certain notions of instability, etc., all were being given more importance in newspapers across the world. And one of the observations that scholars have made in the past is that the imaging was contrary to the aspirations and some of the other developments that were happening in these countries. And India was particularly concerned that it was embarking on path of science and technology development, etc. But its image was that rooted in what we call as stereotypical images of chronic underdevelopment, etc. I mean, it is not to dismiss that there were problems, there are problems of poverty, etc., etc. One cannot say that always the representation is something wrong. But what was the argument was that thus representation was overplayed at the expense of other developments that were taking place. So more and more countries began to recognize this, and when they recognized this, UNESCO, for example, decided that there would be a international commission for the study of communication problems. And all of you are aware of the 1980s document called Many Voices, One World, under the chairmanship of Sean McBride. Now this 300 page plus document is an interesting document, is an interesting document because very often as students of communication, we need to visit and revisit these historical documents. The reason why I am talking about, because it's 1980, it is dated. I mean, it is dated in terms of its publication, no doubt. But when you revisit, then you will find that you are asking the set of your present questions, concerns to books. Therefore, in political economy discourses, historical records, documents, policy analysis become important methodological tools. Methodological tools because you are asking why did this happen, when did this happen, how did this happen. I mean, these are obvious questions that anybody would have. The why, when and how can be very chronological, which very often we do. Broadcasting came to India in 1922, television in 1959. But it's also important to know, 1959 or 1922 is not a romantic year that was suddenly dropped. I mean, it was not a miracle that this date came about. No, there are a set of factors leading to, there are a set of factors leading after, and I think when I say the orientation is towards understanding political economy, my approach or my suggestion or my guidance to you would be, you ought to be looking at a set of what we call as interrelated factors. And McBride Commission, the reason why I flagged it was looks at a whole range of issues. Looks at cultural factors, looks at technological factors, and those were the days when the ideas, for example, of Herbert Schiller, who has talked about cultural domination, cultural imperialism, and you had Karl Nordenstein and Tapio Varis talking about the flow of television programs. So the world body not only looked at the complete, grip of the transnational news agencies on news flow and news content. It also looked at the subsequent media of communication, as in broadcasting and particularly television, and its impact in terms of culture, for example. So what it argued was that there seems to be a lack of a free and a balanced flow of information. If you look at the subtext at the New World Information and Communication Order that came out of the report, the subtext is called as the free and the balanced flow of information. And here is the semantics that you have to get into. It talks about the free one and it talks about the balance. Now both are very loaded terms if you actually begin to kind of question them. Very often freedom of the press has been invoked in many countries of the world, including in India, as representing that freedom of the press is kind of a equivalent of the people's right to know, and media all over the world have always benefited or always kind of justified their call for freedom in the name of us, freedom of people, we want to represent their interests, etc. Now here I would like to bring, when you talk about a free and a balanced state, McBride Commission did not talk a free, independent and balanced flow, no. It only stopped at free and balanced flow because that is one of the probably unstated critique of the international focus at that particular time, where freedom, justifiably so from their perspective, was overriding. But what we need to look at is free press and an independent press. An independent press is the economics of it. Who controls the media? I've already talked about the public sphere argument earlier. And this is where you have scholars like Bagdakan who talk about media monopolies. You have the works of Noam Chomsky in his famous book Manufacturing Content, talks about propaganda and the control of companies. So, it's probably imperative for us to understand that freedom and independence are linked in generating and producing content. So therefore, some of the rhetorical questions that people would ask is, whose freedom are we talking about? Whose independence are we talking about? There are concerns. The concern is that the world is not shaped exactly in terms of the plurality that exists in the world. I mean, I have made this mention in the other session as well. But so when people started looking at ownership, for example, when people start looking at who produces content, and you have had what we call in cinema, you have had the Hollywood cinema, Hollywood syndrome, and how Hollywood and Cold War were together in some representations. So representations, stereotyping, all are important. Are they done deliberately? The answer may not be that they are doing it deliberately, but the fact remains that if that representation and stereotyping sells, they have reason to perpetuate the stereotyping. They have a reason to perpetuate that representation. So, media ownership, structures of communication are very important, institutions that we need to look at. For example, when there was an increasing concern about both problems like paid news and also ethical aberrations in the journalistic fraternity, few or large is a different matter. One of the not so well stated observation was that the independence that an editor of a media or a newspaper particularly was able to maintain. So he or she acted as a buffer between the balanced content in the newspaper and probably the political or the industrial concerns of the owners. Let us be very clear. I mean, media requires enormous capital, and it's not something that minus capitalist ownership media can function. No, the dominant media enterprises all have to have extraordinary resources to kind of run and sustain. So the progressive decay or the progressive removal of the editor in the newspaper operations removed that quality check, and that is how you have had instances of trivia coming into media, etc., etc. In the television field, you have had the Western content. We used to talk about the Dallas programs, the Baywatch programs, etc. But how valid those cultural imperialistic notions are in a country like India, which has a very strong indigenous television industry, as in software. You have huge companies which are producing the staple content that you and I consume every day, and you have a very strong film industry, not only in Bombay, in other places as well. So this is something that but people would go a step ahead and talk that, well, you have indigenous production capability, but are they more influenced, and this is a rhetorical question, are they more influenced by Western values? So the content, power, media structures, content, and its relation to culture is one aspect of trajectory of analysis that has been made, and that would be constituting a large literature pertaining to politics. There are no kind of what should I say, stock conceptual frameworks that the serious study of structures of power, structures of production, structures of distribution, and its impact on consumption pattern, I would say falls in the realm of political economy analysis. Now, coming to the more what should I say, contemporary, where we are moving beyond media. I've already used the term legacy media to describe the traditional print, radio, television, etc. When we look at the present political economy, in new media too, as I said, romantic perceptions of development of any media of communication is the immediate fascination that all of us have, that something powerful is in your hand. I mean, you feel having a notion of power when you have let us say a mobile phone in your hand. It's like your students saying that sir, I have all the photocopies of the books or the material that you have, but having it in your hand does not necessarily mean either you have produced it. What is important is how do you consume it and how do you relate to what is given in the content. Now, in political economy discourse of new media, many layers of institutional analysis are required. In the first place, as mentioned in a different session, and I would like to repeat it, new media is spectrum dependent, one way or the other. And when it is spectrum dependent, spectrum is a resource. You call it electromagnetic resource. Now, what is the link between spectrum and political economy, you might ask? See, when you are in a position of usage of spectrum, and that spectrum, although you would say it ought to be theoretically available, no, spectrum in every country of the world is a resource management which is linked to the policy. That is why you have what we call as telecommunication policies, which determine the quantum and nature of spectrum allocation. Now, in the Indian context too, the auctioning of spectrum, you had a lot of political fallout. Why? Because the stakes are so high. The scale of revenue, the scale of bidding for it In fact, in the post after the present government came to power, at one point in time it was argued that it has realized enormous revenues from the sale of spectrum. Now, when spectrum becomes a realm of licensing and spectrum becomes in the realm of participation in auction, naturally the highest bidder gets the spectrum and he or she pays a price for it. That company pays a price for it. When the company pays a price for a resource, naturally it has to determine to what uses it is going to put the spectrum band that it has purchased. So, for example, when the FM radio licenses auction took place, you have seen that 6 or 7 major companies participate. Which means, is there a cartel arrangement where the control is distributed among few companies? If a control is there with one company, we usually call it as monopoly. But in media, monopolies are rare. What we have is oligopolies, which is controlled by a few, not by one, but controlled by few. So, in telecommunications, in spectrum usage, the infrastructure and manufacture of the sets and the manufacture of the core that is embedded in your telephone, the SIM card, all are interrelated, factors. They are all interrelated factors in terms of the production chain. Now, welfare oriented governments are contemplating, for example, at one point in time Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister has said that if I win, I will give free SIM cards to all. Now, strange as it might be, a big company, for almost 3 to 4 months gave free connections, free SIM cards. You just had to register with your identity and the card was free. Now, card is a gateway for your entry to derive a host of services. It kind of made a significant difference to millions of Indians, wherein they were able to, it also upset the entire telecommunications operations in India. So, the political economy of infrastructure in communications and its control or sway by one or two companies is something that we have to look at seriously. But it's not just the telecommunication operations we are looking at now. We are looking at a complete range. For example, in the Indian context, many companies which are in telecommunications are also into broadcasting, or also into regional channels, or also into many other things. So, there is a integrated control and ownership that takes place. Now, what does it mean to us? Why are we keen on looking at this? It means, it determines in a way how you are consuming, what you are consuming. It determines in a way what is free entertainment that is available for you? What price, you know, we had, we always thought that, as I said earlier, that it's free content. Now, just for a while, look at the cumulative communication bill of your family now. Just take a notebook, put the monthly or the quarterly bill of one communication device was a family unit. Today, every member of the family has a device, and that device is linked to streaming. Streaming, and you might wonder, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial in trying to say that the device was invented so that the economy should work. No, I would not reduce my arguments to that. But what is important here is the whole concept of consumption now is palm head, is in your hand, which means the multiplication of its costing is in numbers. The communitarian perspective that we looked at now has become individual. It's X, it's Y, it's me, it's you. So how do I use it? So these are some of the things that we ought to look at, and the billing pattern, etc., is also important. Now, advertising, many reports like the media and entertainment industry reports talk about the volume of advertising, and that is an indication of the development in the media and communication sector. But what has happened is that advertising and subscription revenues are closing in now. There might come a time where subscription revenue is going to overrun advertising revenue, because the models of advertising today are not necessarily in terms of huge media, but they are more niche media. So, and new conceptions coming in terms of how advertising is going to reshape itself. That might be a topic by some other person, but what is equally important here is data may be free initially, but will be charged later. And this brings us to the last point, that the value of information when it is commodified has an impact on knowledge societies. We all celebrated internet access, and we said that internet access now opens up a wealth of operation. So education institutions, for example, the library services were all made available as in electronic forms, and electronic journal subscriptions, etc., increased. But what is equally important here, has an impact on the kind of services libraries can provide to people like you and me. There are consortium of journals, for example. Mere access to infrastructure may or may not necessarily entail delivery or reception of many services. Some of the knowledge intensive services are becoming expensive, and the more value they have in industry or resource mining, the more expensive such reports and information will be. So, in conclusion, as I have been explaining, communication and media, when looked at from the dimension of power, from the dimension of knowledge, from the perspective of culture, from the perspective of representation, from the perspective of access, brings in certain elements which, as students of communication, as teachers of communication, we should be sensitive, and the methodology, if any, would be to try and look at decisions not just as emanating as an overnight announcement, but to look at it in terms of a series of interconnected developments. For example, so many scholars or many observers have started looking at ownership quite seriously, and we have also had critique of Indian media system as to how increasingly it is representing a particular kind of corporate culture. So, if we want to look at media from its truly functional perspective, some of these questions need to be asked, need to be raised, and you have many works which have dealt with some of these issues, but they may not all be available in a book, but you may have to kind of look at, let us say, the politics of television, for example. You may have to look at the politics of culture, and you may have to look at documents pertaining to information economy. You may have to look at works on knowledge societies. So this together might give you a perspective on the relationship between power, politics, and economics, which are probably the key variables in media and communication operations in any given society, and more so in a country like India. Thank you.